Imagine facing a fallen redwood so massive, 20 feet across, weighing as much as a jet airliner, that a dozen oxen straining together barely make it budge. Around 1900, with no bulldozers or cranes, American loggers spent 10-hour days and risked their lives to move these giants using only muscle, grit, and desperate ingenuity. Why did thousands accept exhaustion and peril just to drag a single colossal log from the forest floor? And what did it take to finally conquer the impossible weight? The answer begins with the moment muscle met its absolute limit. A single redwood, just one, could stretch nearly 200 feet from root to crown, its trunk wider than most living rooms. Imagine standing at the base, craning your neck until your hat nearly falls off, and still not seeing the top. When one of these giants finally crashed to earth, the ground shook. The trunk alone, 20 feet thick, sprawled across the forest floor like a train derailed in the wilderness. Each foot of that log weighed more than a grown man. Stack up the numbers and the mind reels. A 20-foot diameter redwood, green and fresh, could tip the scales at over 200 tons for a single section, heavier than a diesel locomotive, heavier than a herd of elephants, all packed into a single fallen tree. The bark, thick as a man's arm, flaked off in slabs. Sap oozed from fresh wounds, sticky and red as blood. Limbs, some the size of ordinary trees, stuck out at odd angles, snapped and splintered from the fall. The scent of crushed needles and resin hung heavy in the air, mixing with the cold mist that drifted through the coastal groves. Even the most seasoned lumberjack, boots caked in mud and sawdust, paused in AW when faced with a log that seemed to defy the very idea of moving. No road ran straight enough, no animal strong enough, no tool sharp enough to make the job seem possible. The loggers who gathered around such a behemoth did not talk much. They studied the trunk, ran their hands over the rough grain, and did the math in their heads. How do you move a thing that weighs more than a steam engine? How do you even begin to budget, let alone drag it out of the tangled forest and down to the mill? The answer was not just muscle. It demanded something more. A willingness to pit bone and sinew against a problem that seemed bigger than any one man or even a whole crew. Every solution started with the same question: where does human strength end and the impossible begin? In those moments, the forest held its breath. The loggers eyed the monster before them, knowing full well that the next move could mean a day's pay or a trip to the doctor, if they were lucky. For every fallen redwood, there was a story of sweat, danger, and the stubborn refusal to walk away from an impossible task. The real weight was not just in the wood. It was in the challenge itself, staring back at anyone bold enough to try. Sunrise in a logging camp meant another day wrestling with the impossible. Before breakfast, ox drivers lined up their teams, 12 broad-shouldered beasts, each with a yoke pressed tight to its neck. The men checked every chain, every harness, knowing that a single weak link could spell disaster. The air was thick with the smell of sweat and animal, sour and earthy, before the first log even budged. The numbers told their own story. On a good day, a dozen oxen could drag a log weighing 2 tons, maybe 3, if the ground was flat and the skids were slick with lard. That is 4,000 to 6,000 pounds, the weight of a small car. The biggest teams, working in perfect unison, sometimes managed loads up to 12 tons, but only under the best conditions and for short stretches. Against a fresh-cut redwood, those numbers shrank to almost nothing. A single section of trunk could outweigh the entire team by a factor of 10 or more. Even splitting the giants into manageable lengths, it took trip after trip to clear just one tree. The routine never let up. Camps in Minnesota, Michigan, and the Pacific Northwest each held thousands of men, all working 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The morning started with a trudge through the dark woods, boots sinking into mud, frost clinging to beards and brows. By noon, shirts were soaked through, hands raw from gripping peavies and cant hooks. Teamsters shouted commands, their voices hoarse from the cold and the strain. One wrong word, one slip, and a log could careen off the skid, crushing anything in its path, animal or man. The oxen strained against their yokes, eyes rolling, sides heaving. Drivers swung their whips, not out of cruelty, but to keep the rhythm, to coax every ounce of strength from the team. Even then, progress was slow. Grease boys hustled ahead, slathering the skid roads with lard or soap to keep the logs moving. Swampers cleared brush, filled ruts, and prayed the ground would hold. Every haul was a gamble. Sometimes the log stuck fast, sometimes it slid too quickly and threatened to take the whole team with it. Exhaustion settled in long before the sun dipped behind the trees. Shoulders ached, backs screamed, and still the work went on. The men ate by lantern light, hands trembling from fatigue. There was pride in the effort, but also a quiet knowledge that muscle alone would never be enough. The forests were too vast, the trees too heavy, the risks too great. Something had to change. The old ways, for all their grit and sweat, were running up against a wall that no amount of hard work could break. The search for a new kind of power was about to begin. Steam changed everything. In 1882, John Dolbear, a mill owner from Humboldt County, California, patented a machine that looked more like a homemade science experiment than a revolution. The Dolbear steam donkey, as it came to be called, was a squat engine bolted to a pair of wooden skids, a boiler hissing and clanking, and a thick rope wound around a spinning drum called the gypsy head. But looks did not matter. What mattered was muscle, raw, tireless, mechanical muscle. With a single pull, the steam donkey could yank a log weighing 40,000 pounds, 10 times what a full team of oxen could manage on their best day. Every log camp that could afford one snapped up a donkey. Crews of riggers, called donkey punchers, learned to feed the firebox and watch the pressure, their faces streaked with soot and sweat. The engine's whistle cut through the trees, signaling the start of another pull. Men scrambled to hook steel chokers around the logs, then darted clear as the cable snapped taut. The ground trembled when the donkey went to work, dragging a log that would have stopped animals dead in their tracks. But with all that new power came new risks. The cable, stretched tight as a bowstring, could snap in an instant, whipping through the woods with enough force to cut a man in half. Boilers, pushed to their limits, sometimes burst with a roar that echoed for miles. More than one donkey puncher lost fingers, or worse, trying to guide a stubborn rope back onto the drum. Yet for crews used to breaking their backs for every foot of progress, the steam donkey was worth every danger. It meant fewer animals to feed, fewer days lost to stuck loads, and the chance to haul logs that once seemed untouchable. Dolbear's invention did not just move wood. It moved the line between the possible and the impossible, giving loggers a new answer to the question that haunted every camp. How do you get a 200-ton giant out of the forest and down to the mill? The answer for the first time was fire and steel, and the nerve to stand close while it did its work. In the logging camps, invention was a matter of survival. The woods boss, part mechanic and part risk-taker, looked at the endless mud, tangled brush, and impossible hills, and saw a challenge worth beating. Dragging a log through that mess wasted time and strength, so they built bigger, massive wooden wheels, some 10 feet tall, others stretching to 18 feet. Made from thick planks and iron bands, these wheels looked out of place in the wild, but they turned raw muscle into rolling power. Instead of scraping a log across the ground, they chained it beneath the axle, letting it hang in the air. With a team of horses or mules pulling up front, A 20-ton log could roll over ground that would swallow a wagon. The first time one of these giants rolled into camp, men stared in disbelief. When the boss shouted and the horses leaned in, the wheels groaned, the log lifted, and the whole rig moved forward. What once took a dozen animals and a full day's sweat could now be done in hours, even through bogs and snowdrifts. In Michigan's pine woods and Minnesota's frozen swamps, big wheels opened up stands of timber that had always been out of reach. When the land got too rough for wheels, the woods boss had another trick. He used throwaway railroads. These were not city rails, but stick railroads, temporary tracks built from rough ties and whatever iron was on hand. Crews of 40 men could lay 1 mile of track in a day, winding rails over ridges and across swamps. Once the logs were gone, the rails came up and moved on. On a good day, a small steam engine could haul a train loaded with 100 tons of redwood out of the woods in less than 24 hours. Some loads topped 50 tons, pushing the limits of what the rails could take. Every new method brought its own hazards. Big wheels could tip and crush a teamster. Stick rails buckled in spring thaws, sending whole loads off the track. But each invention made the forest a little less impossible. Where muscle failed, rolling leverage and steel rails pushed the line forward, opening the woods one bold idea at a time. A new breed of logger stared up at the trees, not just to bring them down, but to send the logs flying through the air. The solution was as bold as the forest was tall: rig the skyline. Instead of dragging logs across mud and roots, crews turned to the highest trees, choosing the straightest, strongest spar, sometimes a Douglas fir or a redwood, rising 150, even 200 feet above the brush. The high climber's job began at the base, steel spikes strapped to his boots, axe slung over his shoulder. He would drive springboards into the trunk, inching upward, hacking off limbs as he went, the ground falling away with every swing. Each step higher meant one more slip from death. At the top, he would cut away the crown, sometimes with an axe, sometimes with a stick of dynamite. When the top crashed down, the tree shuddered but stood firm, now crowned with a flat platform for the real work to begin. The next task was rigging the spar. Heavy steel cables, guy lines as thick as a man's wrist, were anchored out in every direction, staked to stumps and boulders to keep the spar from tipping under the pull of tons of moving wood. Blocks and pulleys, some as wide as 3 feet across and weighing several hundred pounds, were hoisted up and lashed to the spar's top. The skyline block, the mainline block, each would guide the steel cables that would soon lift logs clear off the ground. Every piece of hardware had to be hauled up by hand, dangled on ropes, and set with frozen fingers, 100 feet in the air. Down below, the rest of the crew took their places. The choker setter, nimble and quick, darted through the slash to wrap 1/2-inch or 3/4-inch steel cables called chokers around the ends of the logs. The whistle punk, usually the youngest hand, stood ready by the signal wire, his whole job to watch for danger and blast the warning whistle if anything went wrong. When everything was set, the steam donkey's cable would tighten and the log would leap from the ground, swinging high above stumps and brush, carried by nothing but steel, sweat, and nerve. For the first time, gravity and friction did not call the shots. The loggers did. The forest floor, once a maze of obstacles, became a stage for a new kind of power, one that soared above the mud and danger, all balanced on the nerve of a man at the top of the world. Come spring, the woods emptied toward the rivers. Ice still clung to the banks, but the water ran fast and cold, perfect for what came next. Loggers turned into rivermen, swapping saws for peavies and boots for greased legs. They slathered lard or soap from thigh to toe, not for show, but to keep the frigid water from biting through their skin. Whole crews waded in, hip deep, balancing on rolling logs slick as glass. The river became a moving highway, choked with 1,000 trunks all jostling for the fastest ride downstream. Each man carried a peavey, a stout pole tipped with a steel spike and a swinging hook. With it, they nudged, spun, and pried the logs away from jams, never letting their balance slip. A wrong step meant a dunking, or worse, a leg caught between logs. The sound of the river was constant, the slap of water, the grind of bark, the shouts of men warning of a shifting jam. They worked in teams, calling out in French, English, or Ojibwe, every man knowing his life depended on the next. Rituals grew from the danger. A lucky coin in a boot, a silent prayer before stepping onto the first log of the day. No one boasted. Everyone understood that the river could take as easily as it gave. The drive was a test of nerve and muscle, a communal gamble played out on the wild current. When a jam broke loose, the whole river heaved, and men scrambled for safety, hearts pounding, boots slick with grease and river mud. The logs would keep moving, and so would the crew, one step ahead of disaster, riding the river all the way to the mill. The men who worked these forests lived with danger as a constant companion. For every 1,000 loggers who punched in each year, one never made it home. That number haunted the camps, higher than in the mines, higher than on the railroads. A snapped cable could cut a man in half. A falling spar tree might crush 3 men before anyone could blink. And yet, when the first high lead lift succeeded, the whole crew stood a little taller. The log, hooked and ready, hung in the air, 50 feet above the stumps, swinging on nothing but steel and nerve. No one spoke as the donkey puncher eased the throttle, the whistle punk's hand hovering over the signal wire. The log floated over brush and mud, landing smooth at the deck. That moment, men like top-loader Charlie McKinney stepped forward. He was known for stacking logs vertical as a house, each 2-ton giant set so precisely that the pile seemed to defy gravity. It took skill, judgment, and guts. While fear clung to every move, pride filled the space between heartbeats. For a brief second, exhaustion and terror faded, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of doing what most folks would call impossible. Today, machines do the work once reserved for sweat and grit, but the drive behind them hasn't changed. As forests shrink and automation accelerates, the value of raw human determination grows harder to measure and easier to forget. The legacy of those who risked everything for progress still shadows every timber we cut. Their story is carved into our landscape and into what we choose to build next. Share your thoughts below.